Good morning, everyone. It's Lee Henson, President and Founder of AgileDad, and it's time for today's episode of the Daily Stand-Up. Without any further ado, let's get started. It's Monday. Happy Monday, everyone. I hope you had an amazing weekend. I hope everything went your way. I'm going to kick this off with a high power question that came in. So I've met with many teams and many different size organizations, but one of the trends that I'm starting to see here as we start to climb our way out of this COVID environment is organizations are starting to really get into growth mode. There are a lot of opportunities out there. One of the things that I'm seeing is that many organizations are hiring. It's a great time to be a recruiter, right? There's lots of opportunity and lots of things that are going on out there. But what I want to discuss with you is an article that I read. It was posted by Jason Yip, and it talks a little bit about why it's so difficult to build teams in high growth organizations. And I thought this was rather interesting because it definitely does approach things that most people don't stop to take a minute to think about, right? So when he's talking about high growth, he's talking about employee count. And you could see some of these growth organizations that are set to double the number of people they have in their organization or even more every single year. So the phenomena that he discovered is that there are two real reasons why this becomes difficult in quickly growing organizations. The first one is you can't make assumptions that your teams are going to be stable, so you can't assume stable teams. And two, you can't rely on cultural osmosis that happens, which makes total sense. It's hard to establish culture when you got such quick growth. So let's start with stability. So in high growth, the odds are that your teams just won't be stable. So what ends up happening is there's several options that accommodate new people. And we're going to talk about the three most popular options. The first one's called sink or swim. The way this works is you keep all of your older teams as is, and you add new people to brand new teams. This keeps some teams stable and likely ensures that new teams will probably struggle. And it sounds crazy, but it's one of those things where if you already have culture built into a team and you're already keeping them stable, new teams are very likely to struggle if you take this approach. The second approach, which is probably the more popular approach, is split and absorb. This is where you take those traditional teams that are doing really well and you start splitting them up, losing the stability, and absorb new people into the new teams with some people from the veterans mixed in with the newbies. This works well, but once again, you're taking that stability away because you're taking people away from high performing or potentially high performing teams and not allowing them enough time to get traction. The second they start to feel like they get traction, they get introduced into a new team and culture. And the third, of course, is absorb and split. And this is where you take new people and add new people to an existing team. And it eventually leads to your teams becoming really large. And I've heard this a lot in some of my trainings. My team's 23 people. I'm like, that's a problem, right? And that loses stability. And you end up splitting them, and that loses stability again. So it's interesting because the only option where any teams really remain stable is sink or swim. But even then, new teams aren't stable. So it's one of these things where you have to understand what's going to work best for your organization. Now, my advice whenever I hear about companies that are doing this high growth thing is I like the idea of absorb then split. It's just what I say is split more often and let people split based on culture, which brings me to number two, talking about culture. The default culture is not what pre-exists. So I'm going to say that again. The default culture is not what pre-exists. The truth is the newbies way outnumber the number of veterans in a high growth organization. So default culture is not what pre-exists. It's whatever the new people are bringing with them, right? And even with careful selection of individuals and good vetting, it's unlikely that cultural assumptions match up perfectly. That's true. I've had organizations where I've worked with where I've taken, and I talk about this quite a bit in my Scrum Master training, where I've taken an individual who was a veteran, a seasoned veteran, and I put them on a team that I felt like was sort of vagabond, and I wanted them to get some stability. So I put the veteran in on a team, and the veteran just wasn't a good cultural fit. So what winds up happening is I moved the veteran from team A to team B, and team B instantly became high performing because he was just the person that they needed. Sometimes the individual's just not a good fit for the team, and that's something that we need to make sure we understand. So if you talk about dealing with high growth, I think one of the things you need to know about dealing with high growth is how not to deal with high growth. And he points out presumptive team splitting. So when he talks about presumptive team splitting, that's splitting a team before you need to. So sometimes you say, oh, I know I'm going to hire more people, so let's split the team, or something along those lines. Whether it's based on subjective anticipation or some kind of quantitative criteria, keeping in mind that your team should never really have more than 9 team members. That's kind of the max for an agile team. It's just you end up doing premature splits, or you end up with unsure or unclean skills. There's a lot of things that happen here, or small teams end up becoming really bored, or you get disengagement and people disalign. It could potentially be a large mess. So I think the key here, and he points it out very eloquently, I like this article. He says, presumptive team splitting leads to unclear missions and missing skill sets, which leads to people filling time with low value activities, which leads to boredom, which leads to disengagement, which leads to people quitting or finding new opportunities, which is true. So I think that you need to understand that you can't do things too quick, but as you grow, it's okay to have a large team for a short time until they get their culture feed under them, and then spin off teams, even if it means getting above 9. So you don't want to get too crazy, but as long as you have some kind of structure about how you're going to go about doing it, then you'll have success. So the next point Jason points out is that structure follows strategy. Organic org design and deliberate culture allow for high growth, or dealing with high growth. So this is probably the biggest point that's made in the entire article. He says structure should be stable where strategy is stable. Structure should be flexible where strategy is volatile. And that makes sense. I want you to think about this. Structure has to follow strategy, right? Because unless structure follows strategy, you get inefficiency, and that's totally true. So if a broader department level product strategy is stable, while more local tactics are all volatile, you should want a structure and shared identity of the department to be stronger and more stable than the team level structures and identities. Makes sense. If you do an absorb and split, which is what I talked about before, that seems to be the preferred for when you're trying to refactor. And the steps that he gives are the steps that I acknowledged earlier. Add new people to the teams. Let the seams appear naturally where people feel like, they bond better here, that things are working better here. And this could be interaction patterns. It could be just cultural differences and things along those lines. Make sure people establish who they get along with and who they're going to work together with. Start nudging things closer, separate rhythms and cadences and events, and make sure people know exactly what's going on. Make sure we get all these things more in line. And then eventually formalize a split and get people to break out. And I think that addresses a lot of the needs. Now, with that question, with that assumption, I often get questions about the difference between culture and strategy. So for culture, I think about how people treat artifacts. What are their espoused beliefs and values? What are basic underlying assumptions? I think the big thing here is you need to understand that people are going to come in with some cognitive bias, with some preconceived notion about how things work, and that we need to take that into consideration. When you're talking about strategy, you start talking about diagnosis of how things are going, a guiding policy, and coherent interactions between people. When you start thinking about incompatible cultures, that means that the basic underlying assumptions make it difficult or impossible for the teams to accept strategic diagnosis, to accept strategic guiding policies, and to see a strategic action as coherent and sensible. So when you start seeing the disconnects, the focus should be on connecting, which makes perfect sense, right? You need to be somewhat deliberate about culture, how it's going to work in your organization, and what you're going to do. And I think that if you focus on these things, this is not only going to help you get to the point where you can grow, but it's going to help you get to the point where you can move through the Tuckman model, the forming, storming, norming, performing faster, and get to a point where you could see your team start to coalesce. One last point, anytime you're doing any kind of high growth within an organization, I have 2 quick pieces of advice. The first one is always seek some type of foundations training that you can give to every single individual that joins the organization. This is going to help, even if the people come from other agile organizations. This is going to help you get everyone on the same page, using the same terminologies and language, and make sure that they have a better experience. The second is, as soon as you can, incorporate an agile coach into the mix, because they can kind of speed this up and help the teams get those seams set right so that everybody kind of knows where to go and what to do. Well, Thank you, Jason, for an amazing article. I'll drop a link to the article down below. And I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the Daily Stand-Up. If you have a topic you want us to cover, feel free to reach out. Learn more at agiledad.com. We'd love to hear what you want to talk about so that we can engage and talk about the things that are most important to you. As always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.